This was a time long before highways, before electricity, and long before the busy cities that exist today. Instead, the eastern coastline of North America was dotted with small settlements, farms, and growing colonial towns. These communities formed what were known as the British colonies. In places like Boston, Philadelphia, and Williamsburg, life slowly unfolded among wooden buildings, dirt roads, and quiet harbors. But most people did not live in towns at all. Instead, they lived in scattered farms surrounded by forests and fields. Life in the early 1700s moved slowly, guided by nature, and shaped by hard work and simple routines. Imagine standing on the eastern coast of North America in the early 1700s. The landscape feels vast and wild. Thick forests stretch for miles. Rivers flow quietly toward the Atlantic Ocean. Small settlements appear here and there, often near rivers or along the coastline. These settlements are part of the British colonial system. At this time, there are 13 colonies along the eastern coast. Each colony has its own character. The northern colonies are known for fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. The middle colonies are fertile and good for farming. The southern colonies grow large crops like tobacco and rice. Despite these differences, most colonists share a similar way of life. Their days are filled with work. Their homes are simple. And their communities depend heavily on cooperation and shared effort. In colonial America, mornings begin early. Very early. Often before the sun rises above the trees. Inside a small wooden house, the room is dark and cool. The fireplace has burned down during the night, leaving behind a bed of soft gray ashes and faint glowing embers. The first person awake carefully kneels near the fireplace. With gentle movements, they push aside the ashes and place small pieces of wood over the embers. Soon, a faint glow appears. Then a flicker. Then a small flame begins to grow. The fire slowly returns to life. This simple act is one of the most important tasks of the day. Without fire, the home cannot be heated. Food cannot be cooked. Light cannot be created. Outside the house, the sounds of morning slowly awaken the farm. A rooster calls loudly in the distance. Chickens begin scratching in the dirt. A cow shifts quietly inside the barn. The wind moves gently through the tall trees surrounding the clearing. And slowly, the sky begins to brighten. Another day in colonial America has begun. Most colonial homes are modest and practical. Many are built using timber cut from nearby forests. Logs or wooden boards form the walls. Mud or clay sometimes fills the spaces between the wood to keep out cold air. The roof is often made from wooden shingles. Inside, the home usually has only 1 or 2 rooms. Large families often share these small spaces. The fireplace stands at the center of the house. It provides warmth during winter and serves as the main place for cooking. The furniture inside the home is handmade. A sturdy wooden table. A few simple chairs. A chest for storing tools or clothing. Beds are often built from wooden frames filled with straw or feathers. Blankets are made from wool that has been spun and woven by hand. Despite the simplicity, these homes are full of activity and life. They are places where families work, eat, rest, and spend time together. After the fire is lit, the next task of the morning is preparing breakfast. Breakfast in colonial America is not fancy, but it is nourishing. Most families eat food that they grow themselves. One common dish is cornmeal porridge, sometimes called mush. Cornmeal is mixed with water and slowly boiled in a pot over the fire. The mixture thickens into a warm and filling meal. Corn is one of the most important crops in the colonies. Many farming methods used by colonists were originally learned from Native American communities. Sometimes breakfast includes bread made from wheat or rye. Butter might be spread on the bread if the family keeps cows. Eggs from chickens are also common. Apples are widely grown in colonial orchards. They are often used to make cider. Interestingly, many colonists drink cider or weak beer instead of plain water. Water sources were not always clean, so fermented drinks were sometimes considered safer. The breakfast table is simple and quiet. Soon, everyone must return to work. Work begins. After breakfast, the day's work begins. For many colonists, farming takes up most of the day. Fields must be planted, watered, and harvested. Fences must be repaired. Animals must be fed and cared for. Farmers grow crops such as corn, wheat, tobacco, and vegetables. Corn grows especially well in the American soil. Men often spend hours plowing fields using simple wooden plows pulled by horses or oxen. The work is steady and physically demanding, but it is necessary for survival. A successful harvest means food for the winter. A poor harvest could mean hardship for the entire family. While men work outside in the fields, women carry out many essential tasks inside the home. Their work is constant and incredibly important. They cook meals throughout the day. They care for young children. They clean the house and manage household supplies. Clothing must be produced at home. Women spin wool or flax into thread using spinning wheels. Then the thread is woven into cloth using large wooden looms. Finally, the cloth is cut and sewn into shirts, dresses, and blankets. Candles must also be made. Candles are created from animal fat or beeswax. They provide the only light available after sunset. Food preservation is another important responsibility. Meat is salted or smoked. Vegetables are dried or stored in cool cellars. These preparations ensure the family has enough food during winter months. Children in colonial America grow up learning how to help the family. Life is not separated into childhood and adulthood the way it often is today. Instead, children gradually take on responsibilities. Young boys help with farm work. They gather firewood, feed animals, and assist their fathers in the fields. Girls help with cooking, sewing, and household tasks. Education varies widely. In larger towns like Boston or Philadelphia, some children attend small schools. But in rural areas, many children learn primarily from their parents. They learn by watching, practicing, and slowly gaining experience. Every skill they learn helps prepare them for adult life. As the sun climbs higher in the sky, work continues steadily. The pace of colonial life is slow compared to the modern world. There are no machines to speed up the work. Most tasks are done by hand. But there is also a certain calm rhythm to the day. The wind moves gently through the fields. Birds sing in the nearby trees. The distant sound of an axe striking wood echoes through the forest. And life continues at its steady, unhurried pace. While many colonists lived on farms surrounded by forests and fields, small towns slowly began to grow along the eastern coast of North America. These towns were usually built near rivers or harbors, where ships could arrive carrying goods from across the Atlantic Ocean. Walking through a colonial town in the early 1700s would feel very different from walking through a modern city. The streets were narrow dirt roads. There were no traffic lights, no paved sidewalks, and no tall glass buildings. Instead, most structures were made from wood or brick, standing only 2 or 3 stories high. Horse-drawn wagons moved slowly along the streets. The sound of wooden wheels rolling over the uneven ground echoed between the buildings. In larger towns like Boston and Philadelphia, ships regularly arrived at the harbor bringing supplies, tools, fabrics, and spices from Europe and other parts of the world. Merchants carefully unloaded crates and barrels filled with goods that were rare in the colonies. For many colonists, visiting one of these towns was an important event. Farm families might travel several miles by horse or wagon just to reach the market. At the center of many towns was the marketplace. This was where farmers, craftsmen, and merchants gathered to trade goods. The marketplace was often a lively but still relatively calm place. Wooden stalls displayed vegetables, fruits, breads, and meats. Farmers brought baskets filled with corn, beans, apples, and pumpkins. Others sold fresh milk, butter, and eggs. The smell of baked bread and cooked meats drifted through the air. Colonists did not always use money for these exchanges. Instead, bartering was common. A farmer might trade vegetables for tools. Another might exchange wool cloth for spices. These marketplaces were not only places of trade but also places where people shared news and stories. Because communication traveled slowly in the colonies, the marketplace was often where people first heard about events happening in other towns. One of the most important people in any colonial town was the blacksmith. The blacksmith's shop was easy to find. The steady sound of hammers striking metal echoed throughout the street. Inside the workshop, the air was warm from the glowing forge. The blacksmith worked with iron and steel, shaping metal into useful tools and objects. He made horseshoes for farmers' animals. He repaired broken tools. He created nails, hinges, and metal parts needed for building homes. Without the blacksmith, daily life in the colonies would have been far more difficult. The work required great strength and skill. With each strike of the hammer, sparks briefly flew into the air before fading away. The steady rhythm of the blacksmith's work became a familiar sound in colonial towns. Besides the blacksmith, many other skilled craftsmen worked in colonial communities. Carpenters built homes, barns, and furniture. Coopers made wooden barrels used to store food, water, and trade goods. Tailors sewed clothing for people who could afford professionally made garments. Printers produced books, pamphlets, and newspapers. In towns like Philadelphia, printing presses played an important role in spreading information and ideas throughout the colonies. Each craftsman learned their trade through years of training. Young boys often became apprentices. An apprentice lived with a skilled craftsman and spent several years learning the trade. During this time, they practiced techniques, assisted with daily work, and slowly developed their own skills. After many years of training, the apprentice could eventually become a master craftsman themselves. Another important place in colonial towns was the tavern. Taverns were not only places where travelers could rest. They were also important social centers. Inside a tavern, colonists gathered to share meals, discuss news, and relax after long days of work. Wooden tables filled the room. The soft glow of candles lit the space. The smell of cooked food mixed with the scent of burning wood from the fireplace. Travelers passing through town often stayed in taverns overnight. Because long-distance travel was slow and difficult, these resting places were essential. Here, stories from distant towns and colonies were exchanged. Sometimes these stories carried important news from across the ocean. Travel during the early 1700s was slow and often uncomfortable. Most journeys were made on horseback or by wagon. Roads were rough and uneven. After heavy rain, many roads turned into thick mud. A trip between towns could take several days. Traveling between colonies might take even longer. For this reason, many people rarely traveled far from their homes. Rivers also served as important transportation routes. Boats carried goods and passengers between settlements. Along the Atlantic coast, ships connected colonial ports with Europe and the Caribbean. Although travel was slow, it played an important role in connecting communities. Religion held an important place in colonial society. For many families, Sunday was a day of rest and worship. Colonists gathered at local churches for services that often lasted several hours. Church buildings were usually simple structures made from wood or stone. Inside, wooden benches filled the room. The congregation sat quietly while ministers delivered sermons. These sermons often focused on moral lessons, faith, and the responsibilities of community life. Church gatherings also provided an opportunity for neighbors to meet and talk. After the service ended, families sometimes spent time visiting with friends before returning home. In colonial America, news traveled slowly. There were no telephones, radios, or televisions. Most news spread through letters, printed newspapers, or word of mouth. Ships arriving from Europe sometimes carried important information about politics, trade, and events happening overseas. But these messages could take weeks or even months to reach the colonies. Because of this delay, many colonists lived their daily lives largely focused on their local communities. Their world felt smaller but also more personal. As the day continued, farmers returned to their fields. Craftsmen continued shaping wood, metal, and cloth. Women worked steadily in homes preparing meals and managing household tasks. Children helped wherever they could. The sun slowly moved across the sky, casting long shadows over the fields. Birds flew quietly above the farms. The steady rhythm of colonial life continued without hurry. Eventually, the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. The warm golden light of late afternoon spread across the countryside. Farmers finished their final tasks of the day. Animals were brought back into barns and pens. Tools were carefully stored away. Smoke began rising from chimneys as families prepared their evening meals. After many hours of work, the quiet evening was finally beginning. As the afternoon slowly fades toward evening, the pace of work across the colonies begins to soften. Farmers finish their final tasks in the fields. Oxen and horses are gently led back toward the barn. Chickens wander across the yard, pecking at the ground as the last warm sunlight stretches across the farm. Inside homes, preparations for the evening meal begin. Thin streams of smoke rise from chimneys as fires are strengthened again for cooking. The golden light of sunset spreads across forests, rivers, and fields. It is one of the quietest and most peaceful moments of the day in colonial America. People are tired from many hours of work. But there is also a calm satisfaction in completing the day's responsibilities. Soon, families will gather together inside their homes. Dinner, or supper as many colonists called it, was usually the largest meal of the day. Unlike modern life, where many people eat several large meals throughout the day, colonial families often ate a lighter breakfast and a modest midday meal. The evening meal was when everyone gathered together. Food depended heavily on what the family had grown, hunted, or traded. A large pot often hung over the fire. Inside the pot might be a thick stew made from vegetables, beans, and sometimes meat. Corn, squash, onions, and potatoes were common ingredients. If the family had recently hunted or raised livestock, the stew might include pieces of pork, chicken, or venison. Bread was usually present as well. It might be made from wheat, rye, or cornmeal. The smell of baking bread slowly filled the small house. Sometimes butter or cheese was placed on the table. If apples were available, they might be baked into simple desserts. Meals were not extravagant, but they were warm, filling, and shared together. After supper, families often remained gathered around the fireplace. The fire was more than just a source of heat. It was the center of family life. The warm glow of the flames filled the room with soft light. Candles might also be placed on the table, though candles were valuable and used carefully. Electric lighting did not exist, so nighttime activities depended on this gentle flickering light. This quiet time allowed families to relax together after a long day. Some people mended clothing. Others repaired tools or prepared supplies for the next day. Women often continued sewing or spinning thread. Children sometimes played simple games or listened quietly to the conversations of the adults. One of the most important forms of entertainment in colonial America was storytelling. Without televisions, radios, or digital devices, stories played a large role in daily life. Family members often shared stories passed down through generations. Some stories were about family history. Others were about local legends or events that had happened long ago. Travelers who visited towns sometimes brought stories from distant places. Stories from Europe, the Caribbean, or other colonies spread slowly from town to town. Children listened closely to these tales. They learned about bravery, hard work, and the values that shaped their communities. Storytelling helped connect people across generations. It also helped make the quiet evenings feel warm and meaningful. In some homes, books were an important part of evening life. However, books were not as common as they are today. Printing presses existed in certain towns, such as Philadelphia, where books, pamphlets, and newspapers were produced. Many families owned only a few books. One of the most common was the Bible. In the evening, some families gathered to read passages together. The candlelight flickered gently as the reader spoke in a calm voice. These quiet moments created a peaceful ending to the busy day. For children learning to read, this time was also an opportunity to practice their skills. Education was valued, even though formal schools were not always available. Outside the home, colonial towns slowly grew quiet as night approached. The marketplaces that had been busy earlier in the day now stood empty. Wooden stalls were closed. Merchants packed away their goods. The dirt roads were lit only by the occasional lantern hanging outside a building. Horse-drawn wagons were no longer moving through the streets. Instead, the town settled into stillness. From inside houses and taverns, faint sounds of conversation could sometimes be heard. A traveler arriving late might lead their horse carefully through the quiet streets toward a local tavern. There they could find a warm meal and a place to sleep. But most residents were already preparing for rest. One of the most remarkable differences between colonial life and modern life was the night sky. Without electric lights, the sky above the colonies appeared incredibly bright. Thousands of stars filled the darkness. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a glowing ribbon. People living in colonial America were deeply familiar with these stars. They used them for navigation and often saw them clearly every night. Standing outside a farmhouse or village, a person could look upward and see a sky far brighter than most people today ever experience. The air was quiet. Only the sounds of insects and distant animals filled the darkness. Eventually, the evening came to an end. Families prepared for sleep. Candles were carefully extinguished to prevent fires. The fire in the fireplace was allowed to burn down slowly. Some embers were left alive so the fire could be easily restarted in the morning. Children climbed into their beds beneath warm blankets. Parents finished their final tasks and joined them. The small house became quiet. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees. The stars continued shining over the vast colonial landscape. And so another ordinary day in colonial America gently came to a close. The people living in these colonies could not yet know how important their small settlements would eventually become. In a few decades, tensions with Britain would grow. These tensions would eventually lead to the great historical event known as the American Revolution. But in the early 1700s, those events were still far in the future. For now, life continued quietly. Farmers would wake again before sunrise. Children would help their families with daily chores. Towns would slowly awaken with the sounds of markets and craftsmen. And the calm rhythm of colonial life would continue, one peaceful day at a time. Life in colonial America was deeply connected to the seasons. Unlike modern life, where food and supplies are available year-round in stores, colonial families depended almost entirely on the natural cycle of the year. Each season brought its own tasks, challenges, and quiet routines. Spring was a time of preparation. Summer was a time of growth. Autumn was a time of harvest. And winter was a time of rest and survival. These changing seasons shaped the rhythm of colonial life in ways that felt both demanding and peaceful. As winter slowly faded, the first signs of spring appeared across the countryside. Snow melted from the fields. Rivers began to flow more freely. Small green shoots pushed through the soil. For farmers, spring meant that work would soon begin again. Fields needed to be prepared for planting. Men and older boys worked long hours turning the soil with plows pulled by horses or oxen. Seeds were carefully planted. Corn, wheat, beans, and vegetables were placed into the earth with hope for a successful harvest later in the year. Women began preparing gardens near the home. These gardens often grew herbs, vegetables, and plants used for cooking or medicine. Spring was a busy but hopeful time. The long cold months of winter were finally ending. By the time summer arrived, the countryside was filled with green fields and growing crops. Days were long and warm. Farmers spent many hours outside caring for their crops. Weeds needed to be removed. Fences needed repair. Animals needed constant attention. Children often worked alongside their parents. Younger children carried water, gathered eggs, or helped watch livestock. Even though the work was demanding, summer also brought moments of beauty. The sound of insects buzzing softly through the fields. Birds flying across clear blue skies. The smell of fresh grass and warm earth. Life moved slowly but steadily under the bright summer sun. Autumn was one of the most important times of the year. This was the season when crops were harvested. The success of the harvest could determine whether a family had enough food to last through winter. Corn was gathered from the fields. Wheat and other grains were cut and stored. Vegetables were collected and prepared for storage. Families worked together to complete the harvest before cold weather arrived. Some foods were stored in cool cellars beneath the house. Other foods were dried or salted so they would last for many months. Apples were harvested from orchards and often turned into cider. The air during autumn carried the smell of fallen leaves and freshly cut crops. It was a season of both hard work and quiet satisfaction. Eventually, cold winds began to sweep across the colonies. The leaves fell from the trees. The days grew shorter. Winter slowly arrived. For colonial families, winter could be a difficult time. Snow often covered the fields for weeks or months. Travel became more difficult. Farm work slowed down, but daily chores still continued. Animals still needed food and care. Firewood needed to be chopped regularly to keep homes warm. Inside the house, the fireplace burned almost constantly. Families gathered close to the warmth of the fire. The house felt smaller during the long winter months, but it was also a place of comfort and protection. During winter evenings, families spent more time indoors. This created opportunities for activities that were difficult to do during busy farming seasons. Women often spun wool into thread. Men repaired tools or carved wooden items. Children practiced reading or writing if books were available. Some evenings were filled with storytelling. Stories about family history. Stories about travels across the ocean. Stories about distant lands that many colonists had never seen. Outside, snow sometimes covered the quiet countryside. The wind moved gently through the bare branches of trees. And inside the house, the warm firelight flickered softly on the walls. Even though life in the colonies involved hard work, people still found time for celebrations and traditions. One important holiday was Christmas. Although celebrations varied among different colonies, many families gathered together for special meals and religious services. Church gatherings during the holiday season brought communities together. Food was shared. Songs were sung. Families spent time reflecting on the year that had passed. Other celebrations marked harvest time or important local events. These moments of celebration helped strengthen the bonds between neighbors and families. They reminded people that even in difficult times, there were reasons to feel grateful. A slowly changing world. During the early 1700s, colonial life seemed stable and familiar to those living in it. But slowly, the world around the colonies was changing. Trade with Europe was increasing. Towns were growing. Ideas about independence and government were beginning to spread. In the decades ahead, these changes would eventually lead to the historic conflict known as the American Revolution. But in the quiet farms and towns of the early 1700s, most people were focused simply on their daily lives. Growing food. Caring for family. Working hard and resting when the day was done. Years passed slowly in colonial America. Children grew into adults. Farms expanded. Small towns grew into larger communities. Through all these changes, the rhythm of daily life remained deeply connected to nature. The rising sun. The changing seasons. The quiet evenings beside the fire. Life was simpler in many ways, though it was also filled with challenges. But for the people who lived during this time, these routines were simply part of everyday life. And now, as our gentle journey through colonial America comes to an end, the quiet countryside grows still once more. The fields rest beneath the night sky. The small wooden houses glow softly with fading firelight. Families sleep peacefully after another long day of work. Above them, the stars shine brightly across the vast sky. The same stars that watched over farmers, craftsmen, children, and travelers hundreds of years ago. The world has changed greatly since then. Cities have grown. Technology has transformed daily life. But the quiet rhythm of those colonial days still remains a peaceful part of history. And as the night settles across the land, the story of early America gently fades into the calm silence of the past. Rest well, and sleep peacefully.